The gleaming steel and glass tower of Chen Technologies pierced the Manhattan skyline like a silver needle threading through clouds. On the top floor, Grace Chen stood at her floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection ghosting against the cityscape beyond. At 65, she cut an elegant figure in her tailored Chanel suit, her silver-streaked black hair swept into an immaculate chignon. The Financial Times had just named her one of the most influential women in tech, but Grace's proudest achievement wasn't her $4.2 billion net worth, it was her 16-year-old grandson, Tommy. Grandmother Tommy's voice carried across her vast office as he burst through the double doors, his school uniform slightly rumpled, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His features were a perfect blend of East and West, reflecting his Chinese-American heritage, but his smile was pure Grace-wide, genuine, and full of light. Tommy Grace's face softened as she turned to embrace him. How was the physics competition? He pulled a gold medal from his pocket, letting it catch the afternoon sun. First place. That algorithm you helped me develop for the robotics portion. Perfect score. Grace beamed with pride, but a shadow crossed her face as another figure appeared in the doorway. Sarah, her daughter, stood with arms crossed, her expression tight. "Mother, you're supposed to be in the board meeting right now. I had to cover for you." Again. The meeting wasn't critical. Grace waved her hand dismissively. The Q3 projections are solid, and Tommy's competition was important. More important than the company, Sarah's voice had an edge that made Tommy wince. Some of us take our responsibilities seriously. The tension in the room was familiar, a well-worn groove of disappointment and resentment that had deepened over the years. Sarah had always felt overshadowed by her mother's success, and now, as CEO of Chen Technologies, she seemed to resent Grace's continued involvement even more. What hurt Grace most was how Sarah seemed to blame her for being closer to Tommy than she was to her own son. Grace's penthouse apartment occupied the top 2 floors of a prestigious building on Park Avenue, where she had lived for the past 30 years. Every surface spoke of careful curation, ancient Chinese artifacts displayed alongside modern art pieces, each item telling the story of a woman who had bridged 2 worlds to build her empire. But among all these treasures, the wall of family photos in her study held pride of place: Tommy's first steps, his school plays, science fairs, moments Sarah had often been too busy to attend. Sarah watched her mother and son from the doorway, her manicured nails digging into her palms. She had everything she'd ever wanted: the title, the corner office, the respect of the business world, yet somehow she was still living in her mother's shadow, still watching her mother steal away what should have been hers, including her own son's affection. None of them could have known that this ordinary afternoon would be the last normal moment they would share. That everything would change in the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and the shattering of glass that would transform their lives forever. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Grace was returning from a late board meeting, her driver navigating the slick streets of Manhattan with characteristic care. She was reviewing quarterly reports on her tablet when the world suddenly tilted sideways. A drunk driver in a pickup truck ran a red light, plowing into the passenger side of her Bentley at full speed. The impact was devastating. Metal screamed against metal, glass exploded inward, and Grace's world dissolved into a cacophony of chaos before everything went black. The last thing she remembered was the taste of copper in her mouth and the distant wail of sirens. Tommy was doing his calculus homework when his mother burst into his room, her face ashen. "It's grandmother," she said, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "We need to get to Mount Sinai Hospital, now." The hospital waiting room was a sterile purgatory of uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lights. Sarah paced restlessly while Tommy sat perfectly still, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. After what felt like eternities compressed into hours, a tired-looking doctor emerged. "Mrs. Chen has sustained severe trauma," the doctor explained, his voice gentle but clinical. The impact caused significant damage to her auditory nerves, resulting in complete hearing loss. Additionally, there's trauma to her spinal cord. While she's not completely paralyzed, she'll have very limited mobility on her right side. She's stable, but her life will be different. Sarah's reaction was unexpected. Instead of grief, a strange expression flickered across her face, something that looked almost like satisfaction before it was quickly masked with concern. "I'll need to take control of her medical decisions," she said immediately. "And the company, of course." temporarily. Tommy wasn't watching his mother, his eyes were fixed on the icy doors. "When can we see her?" he asked, his voice cracking. Grace lay amid a tangle of tubes and wires, her elegant figure now small and broken against the white hospital sheets. Her face was mottled with bruises, and the steady beep of monitors created a mechanical lullaby. Tommy approached the bed carefully, taking her left hand, the one she could still move, in his. Over the next few days, the full extent of Grace's new reality became clear. The doctors explained that her hearing loss was permanent, and while physical therapy might help with her mobility, she would never regain full function of her right side. Communication became a frustrating maze of handwritten notes and rudimentary sign language that Grace struggled to learn with her limited mobility. Sarah took charge with ruthless efficiency, but there was something cold in her efficiency. She scheduled doctor's appointments without consulting Grace's preferences, made unilateral decisions about treatments, and began making moves at Chen Technologies to consolidate her power. "Mother needs to focus on recovery," she told the board. "I'll handle everything else." Tommy, however, threw himself into helping his grandmother adjust. He spent hours researching adaptive technologies, learning sign language alongside her, and developing a system of gestures they could use given her limitations. He noticed things others missed: how Grace's eyes would fill with frustrated tears when she couldn't make herself understood, how she flinched almost imperceptibly when Sarah entered the room. One afternoon, Tommy walked in on his mother in Grace's hospital room. Sarah was standing over her mother's bed, speaking with her back to the door. Grace's face was tight with distress, and Tommy caught the end of his mother's words should have happened years ago. "Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to be powerless." Tommy froze in the doorway, but Sarah had already sensed his presence and turned, her face transforming instantly into a mask of daughterly concern. "Tommy, darling, I was just telling Mother about the new care facility I found for her rehabilitation. It's very exclusive." Grace's eyes met Tommy's, and in them he saw something he'd never seen before in his powerful grandmother, Fia. The exclusive rehabilitation facility turned out to be a converted wing of Grace's Park Avenue penthouse, but it was far from the sanctuary it appeared to be. Sarah had transformed her mother's luxurious home into an elegant prison, dismissing Grace's longtime staff and replacing them with caregivers who answered only to her. The beautiful Chinese artifacts that had once adorned the walls disappeared one by one, replaced by sterile medical equipment. "It's for the best," Sarah would tell visitors, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Mother needs constant care, and this way she can recover in familiar surroundings, but behind closed doors, a different reality played out." Grace's days became an exercise in endurance. Unable to hear, with only partial mobility on her left side, she was at the mercy of others for even the simplest tasks. Sarah made sure that mercy was in short supply. But one morning, as Grace struggled to eat with her left hand, Sarah stood watching, a cold smile playing at her lips. When Grace accidentally dropped her spoon, splattering soup on her hospital gown, Sarah's facade cracked. "Look at you," she sneered, knowing her mother could only read lips if Sarah chose to face her. The great Grace Chen, who always had to be in control, who always knew better than everyone else. She deliberately turned away as she continued speaking, leaving Grace unable to understand, isolated in her silent world. The physical neglect was systematic. Sarah instructed the caregivers to be just negligent enough to avoid suspicion. Meals would be served just slightly too hot or cold, medications would be given at irregular intervals, and bath water would be uncomfortably tepid. When Grace tried to communicate her discomfort through gestures or by laboriously writing with her left hand, Sarah would snatch away the notepad. Mothers, becoming quite confused, Sarah would tell concerned doctors during their weekly visits, "She makes up such stories. It's the trauma." Poor thing, she would pat Grace's hand sympathetically, but her grip would tighten painfully when the doctors looked away. The worst moments came during Sarah's private evening visits. She would sit beside her mother's bed, perfectly coiffed in designer suits that Grace's money had paid for, and finally let her lifetime of resentment pour out. "Do you remember when I won the state piano competition?" Sarah asked one evening, pacing the room like a prosecutor. "You didn't come. You were too busy closing the Singapore deal." She stopped, making sure Grace could see her face. "But you never missed one of Tommy's science fairs, did you?" "Not one." Ying, via secure video link, voted to immediately remove her as CEO. When Grace tried to reach for her tablet to respond, Sarah knocked it to the floor, the screen cracking. "No, Mother. You don't get to defend yourself anymore. You don't get to explain or justify or manipulate. You just get to sit there and listen or wait. You can't even do that anymore, can you?" The physical abuse escalated gradually. It started with accidental bumps that left bruises, a wheelchair pushed a little too roughly, hands that gripped too tightly during transfers. Grace learned to fear the sound of her daughter's heels on the hardwood floors, one of the few sounds loud enough to penetrate her deafness. In public, Sarah played her role flawlessly. She gave touching interviews about caring for her disabled mother, made generous donations to deaf charities, and even started a foundation for trauma survivors. The business world praised her for balancing her duties as CEO with her role as a devoted daughter. Only Tommy seemed to notice the discrepancies. How his grandmother's skin was either flushed or too pale, suggesting irregular heating in her room. How she had lost weight, her cheekbones becoming more prominent. How she would tremble slightly whenever Sarah entered the room. Grace tried to document the abuse, painstakingly writing in a journal with her left hand when she could, but Sarah found it during one of her room inspections and burned it in front of her mother's eyes. Still trying to control everything she said, letting the ashes fall onto Grace's lap. "When will you learn that you're nothing now? Nothing but a burden, a shameful secret we have to maintain for appearances." The security cameras that might have recorded Sarah's actions mysteriously malfunctioned in Grace's wing of the penthouse. The caregivers, carefully chosen for their discretion and dependency on their high salaries, looked the other way. Grace Chen, who had once commanded boardrooms and built a tech empire, found herself trapped in a web of her daughter's cruelty, with no way to call for help. But Sarah had overlooked one detail in her carefully constructed scheme of revenge. She had forgotten that Tommy, with his grandmother's intelligence and intuition, was watching, learning, and putting the pieces together. And like his grandmother had taught him in happier days, he understood that timing was everything. Tommy had always been observant, a trait his grandmother had nurtured since he was young. Details matter, she used to tell him during their coding sessions. One misplaced character can crash an entire system. Now, those same observation skills were sending warning signals he couldn't ignore. It started with small things. The way his grandmother's hands shook when she tried to write messages, not just from weakness but from what seemed like fear. The disappearance of her favorite jade pendants, which she'd always kept close. The strange reluctance of the new caregivers to meet his eyes when he asked about her daily routine. But the revelation came through pure chance. Tommy had been working on a school project about sound waves, using his phone to record various frequencies. He'd left his phone in his grandmother's room one afternoon, tucked between the cushions of the visitor's chair, still recording. That evening, alone in his room, he played back the recording, expecting to delete it. Instead, what he heard made his blood run cold. Pathetic, his mother's voice cut through the background noise. "Look at you, struggling with that spoon like a child. Is this what the great Grace Chen has been reduced to, a clatter?" Followed by a soft whimper. "Oh, did I knock your food over? I guess you'll have to wait until dinner, if you can figure out how to tell anyone you're hungry." Tommy sat frozen, his finger hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to stop the recording, to preserve the image of his mother he'd always known. But Grace had also taught him another lesson: truth, no matter how painful, is better than comfortable lies. The recording continued, documenting 23 minutes of psychological and physical torment. By the end, Tommy's face was wet with tears, but his hands were steady as he saved the file to multiple secure locations. The next day, he visited his grandmother with new eyes. He noticed the fresh bruise on her arm, partially hidden by her sleeve. When his mother entered the room, he saw Grace's minute flinch, a reaction he'd previously attributed to her startled response since losing her hearing. "Mom," he said carefully, "I think grandmother needs more pain medication. She seems uncomfortable." Sarah's smile was perfect, practiced. "The doctors are monitoring her medication carefully, sweetheart. Too much could make her confused. We wouldn't want that, would we?" Tommy watched his grandmother's face as Sarah spoke. Grace's eyes held a desperate intelligence, a silent pleading that broke his heart. He'd always been close to his grandmother, but now he understood that he might be her only hope. Over the next few weeks, Tommy began his careful campaign of documentation. He created a detailed log of his mother's visits and his grandmother's condition afterward. He installed a tiny camera disguised as a button in his school uniform, recording his visits and the visible changes in his grandmother's health. He taught himself basic forensic accounting and began tracking the disappearance of his grandmother's personal items. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy. Each morning, he kissed his mother goodbye as she left for the office. Each afternoon, he endured her performances of maternal concern during their visits to Grace. But at night, alone in his room, he worked tirelessly, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. "I'm going to help you, grandmother," he whispered one afternoon, when Sarah was out at a board meeting. He held Grace's hand as she dozed fitfully in her wheelchair. "I just need a little more time to do it right." Grace's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his, the closest she could come to acknowledgement. In that gentle pressure, Tommy felt both her trust and her fear. He was 16 years old, confronting a truth that would shatter his family forever, but in that moment, he felt the weight of his grandmother's legacy of courage and determination settle onto his shoulders. He would not let her down. Tommy chose a Sunday for the confrontation. He knew his mother's schedule. She always visited Grace after church, when the weekend staff was at their minimum, and there would be fewer witnesses to her cruelty. This Sunday would be different. He arrived early, positioning his Aunt Linda, Grace's younger sister, whom he had secretly contacted with evidence of the abuse in the service elevator with 2 police officers. His father, divorced from Sarah for 5 years, but still on the board of Chen Technologies, waited in the lobby with the family lawyer. A selected group of board members, those most loyal to Grace, were on standby. When Sarah's heels clicked down the hallway at precisely 2 p.m., Tommy was sitting in his grandmother's room, holding her hand. His phone was recording, and the camera he'd hidden in his grandmother's room was streaming directly to the security team he'd hired. Darling, Sarah's voice dripped honey as she entered. "Shouldn't you be studying for your physics exam?" She froze when she saw Grace sitting fully dressed in one of her old business suits, her grey hair elegantly styled, all arranged by Tommy early that morning. "Actually, Mum, we need to talk." Tommy's voice was steady, masking the violent pounding of his heart. "About what you've been doing to grandmother." Sarah's face transformed, the mask of maternal concern cracking. "I don't know what you mean." "I've been taking care of her." Taking care of her, Tommy stood, pulling out his tablet. Like this, he played the recording from that first discovery. Her voice filled the room, dripping with venom as she tormented her disabled mother. Sarah lunged for the tablet, but Tommy stepped back, his finger hovering over the send button of a mass email. "There's more," he continued. "Every incident, every accident, every missing piece of jewelry sold through shell companies, every forged signature on corporate documents. I have it all, Mum. And copies are in the hands of people you can't reach." "You ungrateful little..." Sarah's hand raised, but before she could strike, the door opened. Linda stepped in, followed by the police officers. "Hello," Linda's voice was ice. "We need to discuss what you've done to my sister." What followed was a choreographed takedown of Sarah's carefully constructed facade. The police officers read her rights as Tommy presented evidence of physical abuse, financial fraud, and medical neglect. The family lawyer outlined the criminal charges and civil suits being filed. The board members watchy. Sarah's composure shattered completely. "She deserved it," she screamed, no longer caring who heard. "Do you know what it was like? Growing up in her shadow? Everything I did, everything I achieved, it was never enough. She gave more attention to her company and her precious grandson than she ever gave to me." "No, Mum." Tommy's voice cut through her tirade. "Grandmother tried to love you. I've read her old journals, seen the letters she wrote you at boarding school that you sent back unopened. She tried to connect with you at every stage of your life, but you were too busy resenting her to notice." Grace, silent throughout the confrontation, managed to write a shaky message with her left hand. "I'm sorry I failed you as a mother, Sarah. But what you did was unforgivable." Sarah was led away in handcuffs, her perfect image crumbling as press photographers, tipped off by Tommy's carefully orchestrated plan, captured her exit from the building. By evening, the story of the Chen family drama was breaking across all major news outlets. The legal consequences were swift and severe. Sarah faced multiple criminal charges: elder abuse, financial fraud, medical neglect. The evidence Tommy had gathered was overwhelming, and her own outburst had been captured on multiple recordings. She accepted a plea deal: 15 years in prison, forfeiture of all assets gained through fraud, and permanent removal from any position at Chen Technologies. The corporate fallout was equally dramatic. An emergency board meeting instituted Tommy as interim CEO, despite his age, with an experienced executive team to guide him. The press dubbed him the boy guardian, praising his courage in exposing the abuse and protecting his grandmother. But the most powerful moment came after the chaos subsided. In Grace's room, now restored to its former elegance, Tommy sat with his grandmother as she held a tablet displaying the news of Sarah's sentencing. "I wish it could have been different," Tommy signed slowly, having mastered ASL over the past months. Grace's eyes were wet as she signed back, her movements growing stronger with daily therapy. "You saved more than my life, Tommy. You showed me that love can overcome hate, that good can win." The Chen family would never be the same, but as Tommy helped his grandmother to the window to watch the sunset over Manhattan, they both knew they had emerged stronger. The tower of Chen Technologies still pierced the skyline, but now it stood as a testament not just to business success, but to justice, courage, and the unshakable bond between a grandmother and grandson who refused to let cruelty win. Spring brought new life to Grace's penthouse. Gone were the stark medical supplies and cold-faced caregivers, replaced by warm, professional therapists and the latest adaptive technology. The Chinese artifacts had been recovered from various auction houses and restored to their rightful places, their familiar presence a comfort as Grace began her journey to reclaim her life. Tommy had converted the East Wing into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, complete with a hydrotherapy pool and specialized equipment. But more importantly, he'd created spaces for healing that went beyond the physical. The sunroom, once Sarah's informal interrogation chamber, became a peaceful sanctuary where Grace spent mornings practicing Tai Chi, her movements growing stronger each day. "Remember when you taught me to code?" Tommy signed one morning as they sat in the sunroom, sunlight dancing across their hands. "You said every problem has a solution if you break it down into small enough pieces." He smiled as he helped adjust her Tai Chi stance. "That's how we'll handle this recovery, one piece at a time." Grace's progress was measured in small victories that felt like mountains conquered. The day she managed to hold her favorite teacup steady with her right hand, tears of joy rolled down her cheeks. When she successfully navigated the new tablet interface Tommy had designed specifically for her limited mobility, her triumphant smile lit up the room. Communication evolved into something beautiful and unique between them. Beyond ASL, which they both studied diligently, they developed their own language of subtle gestures and expressions. Tommy created an AI program that translated Grace's facial micro-expressions into text, giving her back some of the nuanced communication she'd lost. The technology wing of Chen Technologies, under Tommy's direction, began developing a whole line of adaptive devices inspired by Grace's journey. Video calls now featured real-time SL translation, and their proprietary software could convert text to sign language using a lifelike avatar. Grace tested each innovation, her business acumen undiminished by her disabilities. The family dynamics shifted and healed. Linda moved into the guest suite, rebuilding the sister bond that Sarah's interference had strained. Grace's ex-husband Richard, Tommy's grandfather, became a regular visitor, his engineering expertise valuable in developing new adaptive technologies. The void left by Sarah's absence filled with genuine love and support. "I never realized," Linda signed one evening during a family dinner, "how much we all lost during those years of letting Sarah control access to you. She didn't just isolate you physically, she tried to break the bonds between all of us." Grace's response was slow but clear, her hands steady. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to appreciate what truly matters. I lost my hearing, half my mobility, and my daughter. But I gained a deeper connection with my grandson, reconciliation with my sister, and a new purpose." The Chen Foundation, once Sarah's tool for public manipulation, was restructured under Tommy and Grace's joint leadership. Its mission shifted to supporting elderly abuse prevention and developing accessible technology for disabled individuals. Grace's story, shared with her permission, became a powerful testament to resilience and the importance of family protection. Tommy's role evolved beyond that of just a grandson. At 17, he balanced his senior year of high school with his responsibilities at Chen Technologies, where he led the Accessibility Innovation Department. His classmates might have been preparing for prom, but Tommy was presenting at tech conferences, his grandmother watching proudly from the front row, her presence a reminder of why their work mattered. The nights were no longer filled with fear. Instead, Grace and Tommy often worked late in her home office, she advising on business strategy while he coded new solutions. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, playing Chinese chess on a specially designed board that accommodated Grace's limited mobility. "But do you ever think about her?" Tommy asked one evening, his signs gentle in the soft lamplight. Grace paused, her face thoughtful. Every day she signed back, "I mourn the daughter I lost to hatred, but I celebrate the family I gained through love." She moved her chess piece with deliberate grace. "Life isn't about the abilities we lose, Tommy. It's about how we adapt and grow with what remains." The penthouse, once a prison, transformed into a haven of innovation and healing. Regular gatherings brought together a growing extended family of choice board members who had stood by them, doctors who had become friends, developers working on accessibility projects, and survivors of elder abuse who found hope in Grace's story. As summer approached, Grace stood at her floor-to-ceiling window, much as she had on that fateful day before the accident. Her reflection was different now, silver hair cut in a chic bob that better suited her new life, a tablet computer at her fingertips, her posture strong despite the lingering effects of her injuries. But her eyes held the same determination, tempered now with hard-won wisdom. Tommy joined her at the window, their reflection together in the glass a testament to the unbreakable bond they'd forged through adversity. Below them, Manhattan hummed with life, and in the distance, the Chen Technologies tower stood proud against the sky, not just a symbol of business success anymore, but a beacon of resilience, innovation, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Grace Chen stood at a podium in the Chen Technologies auditorium. Her hands moved confidently through the air, signing her speech while Tommy voiced her words for the assembled crowd. The occasion was both a product launch and a celebration. The company's revolutionary new adaptive technology suite was being released, and Grace was officially returning to the board as chairwoman emeritus. Life Tommy, translated as Grace signed, has a way of teaching us its most important lessons through our greatest challenges. "A year ago, I thought I had lost everything that defined me, my voice, my independence, my daughter. Today, I stand before you not diminished, but transformed." The audience, a mix of tech industry leaders, disability rights advocates, and family members, watched in rapt attention as grandmother and grandson worked in perfect synchronization. The trust between them was palpable, a bond forged in crisis and strengthened through recovery. Chen Technologies was built on the principle of innovation solving human problems. Grace continued through Tommy's voice, but it took losing my own abilities to truly understand what that means. With my grandson's help, we've created technology that doesn't just assist, it empowers. Tommy, now 18 and preparing for MIT while maintaining his role as head of accessibility innovation, stood tall beside his grandmother. Gone was the school uniform-clad boy who had once burst into her office with a physics medal. In his place stood a young man who had faced unimaginable challenges with courage and compassion. Family Grace signed, her movements elegant and sure, is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by those who stand beside us in our darkest hours, who fight for us when we cannot fight for ourselves, who help us rebuild when our world crumbles. Her eyes met Tommy's, filled with pride and love. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst tragedies. As the presentation concluded, Grace and Tommy walked together through the familiar halls of the company they now jointly steered. Their footsteps traced the path of their journey past the office where they had once shared triumph over science fair projects, past the boardroom where justice had finally been served, and toward a future they were building together. "You know," grandmother Tommy signed as they reached her office, "you once taught me that success in business was about seeing opportunities others missed. But you taught me something far more important this past year." "What's that?" Grace signed back, smiling. "That true strength isn't in never falling. It's in rising again, surrounded by those who love you enough to help you stand." Grace's answering smile held all the wisdom of her journey. In the end, she had lost a daughter but gained an unshakable truth that love, justice, and loyalty were not just words, but actions. And in those actions, she had found not just healing, but triumph.